The Kepler 442 spaceport hummed with the perpetual drone of 1,000 civilizations passing through its vast terminals. Ezra shifted uncomfortably on the hard plasteel bench, his daughter Grace curled against his side, her small hand clutching his jacket even in sleep. The 6-year-old had finally dozed off after 3 hours of delays, her dark curls falling across her face. He hadn't meant to fall asleep. A single father traveling across the frontier sectors couldn't afford such luxuries, not when pickpockets and worse prowled these transit hubs. But exhaustion from double shifts at the terraform, stations and the stress of this emergency trip to Grace's grandmother had finally caught up with him. What Ezra didn't know was that the being sitting 2 meters away had been watching him for the past 4 hours. Grace, not the human child, but the Lupinar operative who'd adopted that name centuries ago, observed the pair with amber eyes that missed nothing. Her silver-white fur caught the artificial lighting of the terminal, and her elongated muzzle rested thoughtfully against one clawed hand. To most species, the Lupinar resembled the wolves of ancient Earth, though they stood upright and possessed intelligence that had mapped stellar cartography before humans had discovered fire. She'd been trailing the human for 3 systems now. Not him specifically, Ezra Caney was nobody, a maintenance worker with debts and dreams that would never materialize. But he'd been in the wrong place at the wrong time, and now he carried something that 3 galactic factions would kill to possess. The small data chip hidden in his daughter's stuffed rabbit toy contained coordinates to a cache of progenitor technology artifacts from the race that had seeded the galaxy with jumpgate networks millions of years before. Ezra didn't know it existed. The man who'd planted it, a desperate scientist running from the Vorthic hive, had died in the terraform station explosion that had prompted Ezra's emergency leave. Grace watched as Ezra's head drooped, finally surrendering to sleep. His arm remained protectively around his daughter, even unconscious. It was such a human gesture, simultaneously foolish and touching. Any predator could strike now. The galaxy was not kind to the unguarded, and yet Grace had served the Galactic Concordat for 247 years. She'd seen species rise and fall, had witnessed the best and worst that sentient life could offer. Humans were newcomers, barely 3 generations into galactic society, still stumbling through protocols that other races had mastered millennia ago. They were weak, short-lived, and hopelessly naive, but they were also stubborn in ways that defied logic. Grace had watched Ezra work quadruple shifts to afford his daughter's education modules. She'd observed him decline lucrative contracts that would take him away from Grace for months. She'd seen him teach the child to read using salvaged datapads, to count using the stars visible from their habitat dome, to dream bigger than the dusty terraform world they called home. The girl, young Grace, stirred slightly, murmuring something in her sleep. Ezra's arm tightened instinctively and he whispered something soothing without fully waking. The child settled immediately, trusting completely in that protection. It reminded Grace of something she'd almost forgotten, pack bonds from her own youth. Before the Concordat, before centuries of solitary operations had hardened her into the perfect weapon. A flicker of movement caught her attention. 3 Vorthic drones skittered through the crowd on insectoid legs, their compound eyes scanning methodically. They were searching for the chip, using quantum scanners that could detect progenitor signatures. In approximately 4 minutes, they would locate the toy rabbit. In 5, they would kill anyone nearby to prevent witnesses. Grace made her decision. She rose from her bench with fluid grace, her long coat shifting to reveal the combat harness underneath. She crossed the distance to Ezra's bench in 3 strides. Her clawed hand touched his shoulder, gently, though she could crush steel with those fingers. Ezra jerked awake, instinctively pulling Grace closer, his eyes wild until they focused on the Lupinar standing before him. Fear flickered across his face. Wolf species were rare in human sectors, and their reputation as warriors was well earned. "Take your daughter and go to Gate 47, Grace said, her voice a low growl that carried harmonics human ears couldn't quite process. "Board the next ship to any destination. Don't argue. Don't ask questions. Move now." What? Who are you?" "Someone who's going to make sure you live through the next 5 minutes. Gate 47, run." Something in her tone, or perhaps the predatory focus in her amber eyes as she glanced toward the approaching Vorthic, convinced him. Ezra scooped his daughter into his arms, the child barely stirring, and grabbed their bag. He hesitated only a moment, looking back at the wolf woman who'd given him this chance. "Thank you," he said simply. Grace didn't respond. She was already moving toward the drones, her hand sliding to the plasma pistol at her hip. The Concordat wanted that chip intact, but Grace had spent 2 centuries learning which rules mattered and which didn't. Some things were worth more than ancient coordinates, like a father's desperate love for his daughter, like the innocent trust of a sleeping child, like the stubborn human insistence on kindness even in an unkind universe. The first drone spotted her and chittered an alarm. Grace smiled, showing far too many teeth. "Come on then," she growled. "Let me show you why we're called apex predators." Plasma fire lit the terminal. Civilians scattered. Alarms blared. And Ezra ran with his daughter toward Gate 47, never knowing that the wolf woman had just burned every bridge to her old life to give them that chance. Later, much later, when Grace finally caught up to them, after the Concordat debriefing, after the endless questions, after turning in her badge and accepting exile from the organization she'd served for centuries, she found Ezra on a colony world called New Haven. He was working at a small repair shop, Grace playing in the yard behind the building. He looked up when her shadow fell across his workbench, recognition dawning slowly. Then fear as he remembered what that chip in the rabbit had been, what chasing it had cost. But Grace simply set a worn travel bag on the bench and said, "I hear you're hiring. I'm good with security systems." Ezra stared at her, understanding and disbelief warring on his face. "You gave up everything for us. Why?" Grace glanced toward the yard where young Grace laughed, chasing butterflies that had been gene-crafted to survive on this new world. Such a human thing, she thought, bringing butterflies to alien worlds, making homes in impossible places, protecting the next generation no matter the cost. "Because," Grace said finally, "someone needed to watch your back. You humans are terrible at staying out of trouble." Ezra smiled then, tentative but genuine, and extended his hand. "Welcome to the pack." Grace took it, her clawed hand gentle around his fragile human bones, and felt something long frozen in her chest finally thaw. Perhaps humans weren't the only ones who could learn new tricks.